My mother clinked her glass at Christmas dinner, laughed, and said, "Look at your sister buying her dream house, while you're still alone with no life of your own." The entire room erupted into smirks and cruel chuckles. They thought I was the sad, single disappointment of the family, the one who couldn't keep a man or build a real future. My sister smirked and asked, "When are you finally going to settle down?" I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just pulled out an envelope, laid it in the center of the table, and smiled. I said, "I already did. I just didn't invite people who never believed in me." The table went dead silent as my mother opened it and her jaw dropped. Before we get into the story, comment down below the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Clara, and at 28 years old, I finally understood the role I had been assigned in my own family, the silent disappointment. For as long as I can remember, my mother, Eleanor, operated on a strict hierarchy where approval was a currency, and my younger sister, Gemma, held the endless line of credit. Gemma was the golden child, the one whose every milestone was celebrated with grand dinners and tearful toasts. When she got engaged and bought her first suburban home, my mother treated it like a royal coronation. I, on the other hand, took a very different path. After a painful breakup 3 years ago, I stopped measuring my worth by traditional family milestones. I threw myself into my work, kept my personal life entirely private, and stopped seeking my mother's approval. But in Eleanor's eyes, a 28-year-old woman without a ring on her finger or a white picket fence was automatically a failure. To my mother and sister, my quiet independence wasn't a choice. It was proof that I was struggling, lonely, and completely incapable of building a real future on my own. When December rolled around, I drove down to my hometown for Christmas dinner, already feeling the familiar tightness in my stomach. The moment I stepped through the front door of my mother's house, the atmosphere shifted into subtle hostility. Eleanor didn't greet me with a hug or a warm smile. Instead, her eyes slowly swept over me, taking in my simple black sweater and tailored trousers with open disdain. "I see you didn't bother dressing up for the holidays," she murmured, barely offering her cheek for a kiss. Before I could even hang up my coat, the passive-aggressive commentary began. She dropped quiet, stinging remarks about how unfortunate it was that I was still renting a modest place and how my freelance digital design work was hardly a stable career compared to a proper corporate job. Gemma and her fiancé, Richard, were sitting by the fireplace, sipping champagne like royalty. Gemma offered me a pitying look, sighing dramatically as she remarked on how stressful it must be to travel alone during the holidays without a partner to share the drive. They spoke down to me as if I were a charity case who had stumbled into their perfect family picture. Every comment was a calculated jab designed to remind me of my place at the bottom of the family ladder, but I kept my composure, taking a quiet sip of water and waiting for the evening to unfold. By the time dinner was served, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Extended family members filled the dining table, their laughter echoing off the walls while I sat quietly near the end, observing the grand spectacle my mother had orchestrated. Halfway through the meal, Eleanor tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon, demanding everyone's attention. She stood up, her face beaming with pride as she raised a toast to Gemma and Richard. She spoke passionately about their real, tangible achievements, their upcoming lavish wedding, their prestigious corporate titles, and the impressive $600,000 suburban house they had just secured. Then, with calculated precision, her gaze shifted down the table and landed squarely on me. The warmth in her voice vanished, replaced by a sharp, patronizing edge. "Of course, we can't all be blessed with such ambition," she said, chuckling softly as if sharing a light-hearted joke. "Look at Clara, still single, still living day-to-day with no life of her own, and still waiting for someone to save her." A wave of cruel chuckles swept across the table. Relatives exchanged knowing, pitiful glances. Gemma leaned forward, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. "It's okay, Clara," Gemma said condescendingly, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "If you ever decide to settle down, Richard and I can help you find a simple starter home, or maybe a quiet, entry-level office job, so you don't have to struggle alone forever." They thought they were reducing me to nothing in front of everyone we knew. They expected me to lower my head, blink back tears, or storm out of the room in disgrace. But as the room fell quiet, waiting for my reaction, I just looked at my mother and sister, entirely unmoved. I didn't lower my head, and I didn't blink back tears. Instead, I slowly reached down into my leather handbag, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and laid it flat in the exact center of the dining table. Since you're all so deeply concerned about my financial stability and my lonely future, I said, my voice ringing clear and steady across the room, I think it's time to clear up a few misunderstandings. Eleanor frowned, her sharp eyes dropping to the envelope. What is this, Clara? Some kind of dramatic stunt?
No, Mom.
It's reality, I replied calmly. While you were all assuming I was struggling and waiting around to be saved, I was actually building a life. Over the last 3 years, I didn't waste my time trying to perform for an audience or impress people who only value superficial status. I unclasped the envelope and slid the legal documents across the polished wood toward my mother and sister. I didn't buy a starter home with a massive mortgage, Gemma. I continued, looking my sister dead in the eye. And I don't work an entry-level freelance gig. I am the founder and sole owner of Apex Creative Solutions, a digital agency that generated over $1.2 million in revenue last year alone. Completely debt-free, entirely self-funded, and managed without a single dime or word of encouragement from this family. Gemma's smirk instantly froze, her eyes scanning the official financial statements and corporate registration certificates bearing my full name. The condescending atmosphere at the table dissolved into dead silence, every relative leaning forward, completely paralyzed by what they were seeing. As my mother flipped through the pages, her hand began to tremble, but the real shock came when she reached the final document, a commercial real estate property deed. What is this? Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking as her eyes scanned the top header. That, I said smoothly, is the deed to the historic brick commercial complex on 5th Street in the downtown district. I purchased it outright 6 months ago. Gemma's fiancé, Richard, suddenly went pale. He leaned over, staring at the address with wide, disbelieving eyes. Wait, the 5th Street Plaza? We've been trying to secure a lease there for our firm's new headquarters for 4 months. The management company kept telling us the owner was reviewing corporate profiles. I am the owner, Richard, I said, looking him in the eye. And I was the one who personally rejected your lease application last week after reviewing your company's high-risk financial projections. Gemma gasped, her smug demeanor completely evaporating into panic. You can't be serious. Clara, that lease was supposed to expand Richard's business. I make business decisions based on logic, not charity, I replied, my tone icy and unyielding. You all spent years looking down on me because I chose to stay single and work in silence instead of rushing into traditional milestones to show off. You assumed that because I didn't brag or demand attention, I had nothing. But while you were busy competing for Mom's approval and living on borrowed money, I built absolute financial freedom and total autonomy. I don't need a partner, a mortgage, or a family's permission to live an extraordinary life. Eleanor sat frozen, staring at the property deed, while the rest of the family sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence. The arrogant smirk that Gemma had worn all evening was completely gone, replaced by a look of sheer desperation as she realized what this meant for Richard's business. Clara, sweetie, my mother began, her voice suddenly shifting into a sickly sweet, accommodating tone. You never told us any of this. We're your family. We could have helped you manage this, or Richard could have partnered with you. I let out a soft, cold laugh. Partner with me? 10 minutes ago, Mom, you called me a lonely disappointment in front of everyone. You and Gemma spent the entire night mocking my life because I didn't fit into your narrow idea of success. Gemma reached across the table, her hands trembling slightly. Clara, please. We were just joking around. You know how Mom is. We can fix this. Maybe we can talk about that commercial lease over coffee tomorrow? No, Gemma, I said, standing up and folding my coat neatly over my arm. There's nothing to discuss. I didn't bring these papers here to get your validation or to do you favors. I brought them so you would finally understand that I don't need anything from any of you. I gathered my documents, leaving my full plate untouched on the table. My mother scrambled out of her chair, stammering apologies and pleading for me to sit back down, but I didn't pause. I walked straight out the front door into the crisp winter air, leaving their desperate, scrambling voices echoing behind me. 6 months have passed since that Christmas dinner, and my life has never been more peaceful. Sitting on the balcony of my oceanfront condo, listening to the gentle rhythm of the waves, I finally feel the full weight of the freedom I built for myself. My mother and sister have tried calling and texting countless times, offering late apologies and attempting to repair the bridge they burned. But I kept my boundaries firm. I learned that real self-worth doesn't come from proving your critics wrong. It comes from realizing you never needed their approval in the first place. Building a life on your own terms, without rushing into relationships or careers just to satisfy other people's expectations, is the greatest form of independence you can give yourself. What would you have done if you were in my shoes at that dinner table? Would you have walked away or given them a second chance? Comment your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and click the video on your screen for another crazy story. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.